The morning sun streamed through the massive glass windows of International Terminal B, casting long shadows across the polished floors of Richardson Mills International Airport. Marcus Johnson Jr. moved through the bustling terminal with the easy confidence of someone who knew every corner of the massive building. At just 16, he carried himself differently from typical teenagers. No slouching, no uncertainly shuffling along. Instead, his designer sneakers moved with purpose across the familiar territory he'd grown up exploring. His dark blue Burberry jacket and pressed khakis might have seemed too formal for someone his age, but Marcus had learned early from his father that presentation mattered. He'd picked up these lessons during countless hours spent watching his father transform this very airport from a regional hub into one of the country's premier international airports. The security guards who'd known him since he was knee-high smiled and waved as he passed. To them, he wasn't just another teenager. He was little Marcus, the son of the man who had changed their lives by creating thousands of new jobs and opportunities. Today was special. Marcus had just finished his last exam before spring break, and his father had promised to take him to their favorite spot, the observation deck that overlooked the entire airfield. It was their tradition, starting from when Marcus was just 5 years old, sitting on his father's shoulders, pointing excitedly at every plane that took off. Now, 11 years later, he could name every aircraft model that passed through their runways. As he walked, Marcus checked his phone, reading a text from his father, wrapping up an emergency board meeting. "Meet me at the usual spot in 15. A smile tugged at his lips as he thought about their plans to finally discuss the summer internship program his father had been hinting about for weeks. Marcus had already started learning about airport operations, dreaming of the day he'd help run this place alongside his dad. The familiar sense of coffee from terminal cafes and the distant rumble of jet engines filled the air as Marcus navigated through the morning crowd. Business travelers rushed past with their rolling suitcases, families herded sleepy children toward their gates, and pilots and flight attendants strode by in their crisp uniforms. To others, it might have seemed chaotic, but to Marcus, it was a perfectly choreographed dance he'd grown up watching. He reached into his pocket, feeling the familiar shape of his special access card, a privilege he never took for granted. His father had made him memorize every security protocol and rule before giving him that card on his 15th birthday. "With great privilege comes great responsibility," his father had said, sounding just like Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. Marcus had rolled his eyes then, but he understood the weight of those words now. Taking a shortcut through a less crowded corridor, Marcus headed toward the executive offices. The morning light caught the gold-framed photographs lining the walls, images showing the airport's history, including several of his father shaking hands with mayors, governors, and even 2 presidents. In one of them, a much younger Marcus stood proudly beside his father at the grand opening of the new international terminal. Little did Marcus know that this ordinary morning was about to turn into something that would change not just his life, but the entire culture of the airport he called his second home. As he rounded the corner toward the restricted access area, he couldn't have imagined that his next encounter would spark a controversy that would make headlines across the country and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and power. He passed the last security checkpoint, where most of the regular officers smiled and nodded in recognition. But today, there was someone new on duty, someone who didn't know who Marcus was, someone who was about to make a judgment that would set off a chain of events nobody could have predicted. Officer James Sullivan stood at his post, his back straight as a rod, scanning the terminal with eyes that had spent 15 years watching for trouble. New to Richardson Mills International Airport, but not to the job, he transferred here just 3 weeks ago, bringing with him a reputation for being strict and by the book. His previous supervisor had called him thorough, but his former colleagues had other words for it, words they kept to themselves. When Sullivan spotted Marcus walking confidently through the restricted area, his jaw tightened immediately. The sight of a young black teenager in expensive clothes moving through a staff-only section triggered something in him. All his preconceptions rushed to the surface like bubbles in boiling water. He didn't see a boy who belonged. He saw what he wanted to see, a threat. "Hey, you there, stop right where you are." Sullivan's voice boomed across the corridor, bouncing off the walls. Several passing airport employees turned to look, surprised by the unusual disturbance in their normally peaceful morning routine. Marcus stopped walking, his hand still holding his phone, a text to his father half-written. Sullivan marched toward Marcus, his heavy boots echoing against the polished floor. His hand instinctively rested on his radio, ready to call for backup. "This is a restricted area," he barked, his face reddening with each step. "How did you get in here? Where's your boarding pass?" Marcus began to reach for his access card, but Sullivan's sharp voice cut through the air again. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The command drew more attention, and now people were starting to gather at a distance, watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. "Sir, I can explain," Marcus started, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. "I have authorization to." "Authorization?" Sullivan scoffed, cutting him off. His eyes narrowed as he looked Marcus up and down, taking in the designer clothes. "Sure you do. Let me guess. You just happened to walk through that secure door by accident. Or maybe you think those fancy clothes give you special privileges." A small crowd had formed now, with some passengers pulling out their phones to record the incident. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could hear their whispers. His cheeks burned with humiliation, but years of his father's coaching about handling difficult situations kept him composed. "Officer, if you'll just let me show you my ID." Marcus tried again, his voice remaining remarkably calm for a 16-year-old being publicly confronted. "Oh, now you have ID." Sullivan's voice dripped with sarcasm. He shifted his weight, purposefully blocking Marcus's path of retreat. "Listen, kid, I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. I've seen every trick in the book. You picked the wrong airport to mess with." Two more security officers approached, drawn by the commotion. They exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing Marcus, but hesitating to intervene with their new supervisor. One of them, Officer Rodriguez, who'd watched Marcus grow up, took a step forward, but Sullivan waved him back. "Call the police," Sullivan ordered, his voice carrying across the now silent corridor. "We've got a trespasser in a restricted area." He turned back to Marcus, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're about to learn a serious lesson about airport security, young man." Marcus stood there, his heart pounding but his exterior calm, knowing that somewhere in this very building, his father was wrapping up his meeting, unaware that his son was being treated like a criminal in the airport they called home. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, being threatened with arrest in the very building that had his family's name on the deed. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and in the distance, the sound of more security personnel approaching echoed through the corridor. Sullivan stood there, radiating authority, completely unaware that his next few actions would not only change his career forever, but would spark a conversation that this airport and the entire city desperately needed to have. The fluorescent lights of the airport corridor seemed to grow harsher as Officer Sullivan's voice echoed through the terminal, drawing even more attention to the unfolding scene. Marcus stood there, his expensive sneakers rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of dozens of stares from passengers and airport staff who had stopped to watch the spectacle. "Empty your pockets," Sullivan demanded, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Marcus's stomach turn. "Slowly, where I can see everything." The teenager could hear phones clicking and whirring as people recorded the incident, their cameras capturing every moment of his humiliation. Marcus began removing items one by one. His phone, his wallet, and finally, the access card that could end this whole situation. But before he could explain, Sullivan snatched the card from his hand. Well, what do we have here?" he sneered, turning the card over in his hands. "This looks real enough, but we both know it can't be genuine. These cards are only issued to airport executives and authorized personnel." A woman in a business suit stopped nearby, her face twisted with concern. "Is this really necessary?" she called out. "He's just a boy." Sullivan shot her a stern look that made her step back, though she kept her phone raised, still recording. "Ma'am, this is airport security business," Sullivan announced loudly, seeming to grow taller with the attention. This young man was caught in a restricted area. For all we know, he could be a security threat. The word threat hung in the air like a heavy cloud, making Marcus flinch internally, though his face remained composed. Officer Rodriguez, who had known Marcus for years, finally found his voice. "Sir, I think there's something you should." But Sullivan cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Unless you want to join him in trouble, Rodriguez, stay out of this." Sullivan snapped. The younger officer stepped back, his face twisted with conflict, knowing he was watching a terrible mistake unfold, but feeling powerless to stop it. Marcus took a deep breath, channeling every lesson his father had taught him about dignity under pressure. "Officer Sullivan," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling he felt inside, "if you'd just make one phone call to the airport administration." "Oh, now you know my name," Sullivan interrupted, his face reddening further. "And you've got connections in administration too. This just keeps getting better." He let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the walls. "Next thing you'll tell me is that you own the airport." The crowd had grown larger, with whispers rippling through it like waves. Some people shook their heads in disgust at Sullivan's behavior, while others filmed everything on their phones. Marcus could already imagine the social media storm this would create. Black teen harassed at Richardson Mills Airport. Another viral video of prejudice in action. Sullivan reached for his radio again. "I need additional units to Terminal B, restricted section. I've got a possible security breach and a suspect who's being uncooperative." The word suspect stung Marcus's ears. In 16 years, he had never been a suspect in the building that was practically his second home. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus stood there, surrounded by the growing crowd, his belongings scattered on a nearby security table. He could see his reflection in the terminal's windows, a young black teenager being treated like a criminal in his father's airport. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so painful. From somewhere in the crowd, he heard someone say, "Isn't that Marcus Johnson?" The name rippled through the onlookers, and Sullivan's expression flickered for just a moment. But the officer doubled down, too committed to his assumption to back down now. Up against the wall, Sullivan ordered, his voice carrying a finality that made Marcus's heart sink. "We'll let the police sort this out." The teenager complied, placing his hands on the cold wall, aware that every moment was being captured on dozens of phones. He closed his eyes briefly, knowing that somewhere in this very building, his father was about to hear about this incident, and everything was about to change. The terminal fell eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of airplane engines and the clicking of phone cameras breaking the silence. In this moment of ultimate humiliation, Marcus held on to one thought. His father had always told him that true character shows not in how you're knocked down, but in how you rise back up. The atmosphere in Terminal B crackled with tension as Marcus stood against the wall, surrounded by whispers and camera phones. Then suddenly, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the chaos like a knife through butter. "What exactly is going on here with my son?" Marcus Johnson Sr. emerged from the crowd like a force of nature. At 6'2", dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, he commanded attention without even trying. The airport board members trailing behind him stopped short, creating a scene that looked like something out of a movie. Sullivan, still holding his radio, turned toward the voice. The color drained from his face as he recognized the man from the massive portrait hanging in the main terminal. Marcus Johnson Sr., CEO of Richardson Mills Airport Holdings, one of the most powerful figures in American aviation. "I asked a question, officer," Mr. Johnson said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone in the vicinity stand a little straighter. "Why is my 16-year-old son being treated like a criminal in our airport?" The word "our" hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sullivan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The crowd had gone completely silent, phones still recording what was quickly becoming a viral moment in the making. "Dad," Marcus said, finally turning from the wall, relief washing over his face. Mr. Johnson moved to stand beside his son, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. The contrast was striking. Both father and son dignified and well-dressed, facing down an increasingly uncomfortable Officer Sullivan. "Mr. Johnson, sir," Sullivan stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." His hands fumbled with Marcus's access card, which suddenly felt like it was burning his fingers. "A misunderstanding?" Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "From where I stand, Officer Sullivan, I see something far more concerning than a misunderstanding." He glanced at Marcus's belongings scattered across the security table, then at the gathered crowd with their phones, and finally at Officer Rodriguez, who looked both relieved and vindicated. One of the board members, an elderly woman with silver hair, stepped forward. "Marcus, dear, are you all right?" she asked, shooting Sullivan a look that could freeze hell. "We were just discussing your father's plans for the youth aviation program when we heard the commotion." Sullivan's face had now turned from red to an ashen gray as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. The access card in his hand, the one he'd dismissed as fake, suddenly felt like evidence of his own prejudice and poor judgment. Mr. Johnson surveyed the scene one more time before speaking again. "Officer Rodriguez," he called out, and the younger security officer stepped forward immediately. "Please gather Marcus's belongings." Then he turned to the crowd, his voice projecting naturally. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption to your morning. Rest assured, this incident will be addressed appropriately." The whispers in the crowd had turned to murmurs of recognition. "That's Marcus Johnson, the owner." No wonder the kid knew his way around. The story was already spreading through the terminal like wildfire, phones buzzing with texts and social media updates. Mr. Johnson turned back to Sullivan, who looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. "Officer Sullivan, I believe we should continue this discussion in my office. Officer Rodriguez can cover your post." It wasn't a suggestion. As Marcus collected his belongings from Rodriguez, his father's hand still steady on his shoulder, he caught a glimpse of Sullivan's face. The man looked destroyed, but something in Marcus, something that reflected his father's leadership, made him hope this moment would lead to change rather than just punishment. The crowd began to disperse as Mr. Johnson led his son and a very subdued Officer Sullivan toward the executive offices. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting long shadows behind them. In that moment, everyone present knew they had witnessed something significant, not just a powerful man coming to his son's rescue, but the beginning of a conversation that this airport, and perhaps the whole country, needed to have. The walk to the executive offices felt like the longest journey of Officer Sullivan's life. Every step on the polished floor echoed with his mounting regret as he followed Mr. Johnson and Marcus, passing wall after wall decorated with awards, certificates, and photos, all bearing the Johnson name. They entered a corner office that showcased a breathtaking view of the airfield through floor-to-ceiling windows. Private jets and massive commercial airliners moved across the tarmac like pieces on a giant chessboard. Sullivan stood awkwardly by the door, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around his neck. "Please, have a seat, Officer Sullivan," Mr. Johnson said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his massive desk. His voice remained surprisingly gentle, not at all what Sullivan had expected from a man whose son he had just humiliated. Marcus took a seat next to his father, his composure still intact despite everything that had happened. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Sullivan began, his voice barely above a whisper. The confidence that had fueled his actions in the terminal had completely abandoned him. His hands, usually steady from years of security work, trembled slightly as he placed them in his lap. "Then perhaps you should listen first," Mr. Johnson replied, leaning forward in his chair. "That young man you just accused of trespassing, He took his first steps in this airport, the security footage room you use for surveillance. He learned to read in there, doing homework while I worked late nights. Every holiday season, he helps organize our staff Christmas party. This isn't just an airport to him, it's home. Sullivan's face flushed deep red as he looked at Marcus, seeing him truly for the first time, not as a threat or a stereotype, but as someone's child, someone who belonged here more than he did. "What puzzles me, Officer Sullivan," Mr. Johnson continued, his voice remaining measured, "is why you didn't simply check his credentials. The card you dismissed. It has a higher security clearance than your own. A simple scan would have prevented this entire situation." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, a plane roared down the runway, its engines screaming into the morning sky. Sullivan stared at his hands, unable to meet either Johnson's eyes. "I made assumptions," Sullivan finally admitted, his voice cracking. "Terrible, unfair assumptions. I saw a young black teenager in a restricted area, and I didn't even consider." He trailed off, the weight of his prejudice finally hitting him full force. To everyone's surprise, it was Marcus who spoke next. "Dad," he said, turning to his father, "remember what you always say about moments of crisis being opportunities for change." Mr. Johnson's face softened as he looked at his son, pride evident in his eyes. Even in this moment, Marcus was thinking like a leader. "Officer Sullivan," Mr. Johnson said, turning back to the security officer, "my son just demonstrated something remarkable. Instead of anger or revenge, he's suggesting we find a way forward. So here's what's going to happen. You have a choice to make." Sullivan looked up, expecting the worst. Termination, public humiliation, maybe even legal action. Instead, he saw something unexpected in Mr. Johnson's eyes. Hope. "You can either clear out your locker and leave with a stain on your record," Mr. Johnson continued, "or you can be part of the solution. Help us create a new training program for our security staff. Share your story. Show others how easy it is to let prejudice cloud judgment, and more importantly, how to do better." The office fell silent again. Outside, planes continued to take off and land. Passengers continued their journeys. But in this room, something profound was happening. Sullivan looked at Marcus, then at Mr. Johnson, and for the first time that morning, he felt something he didn't expect. Gratitude. "I want to do better," Sullivan said finally, his voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "I want to be part of the solution." Mr. Johnson nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's begin," he said, reaching for his phone to call a meeting with HR. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the office floor, marking the start of what would become a transformative day for Richardson Mills International Airport. 1 week after the incident, the main conference room of Richardson Mills International Airport buzzed with nervous energy. Every security supervisor, manager, and chief officer sat around the massive oak table, their eyes fixed on Officer Sullivan as he stood at the front of the room. The morning light streamed through the windows, highlighting the sweat on his forehead. "I've worked in airport security for 15 years, Sullivan began, his voice shaky but determined. "And last week, I made the biggest mistake of my career." He glanced at Marcus and Mr. Johnson, who sat quietly at the back of the room, giving him an encouraging nod. The room was so quiet you could hear the distant rumble of planes taking off. Sullivan took a deep breath and continued. "I saw a young black teenager in a restricted area. And I didn't see Marcus Johnson, the owner's son. I didn't see a bright young man who grew up in these terminals. I saw what my prejudices wanted me to see. A threat." Photos from the incident appeared on the screen behind him. Cell phone footage that had gone viral, showing his confrontation with Marcus. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing how easily it could have been them making the same mistake. "But what happened next changed my life," Sullivan said, his voice growing stronger. "Instead of firing me, instead of punishing me, Mr. Johnson and Marcus showed me something I never expected: mercy and wisdom. They helped me understand that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system that needs to change. Mr. Johnson stood up and joined Sullivan at the front of the room. "What Officer Sullivan experienced isn't unique," he said, commanding the room's attention. "But his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and work toward change, that is unique. That's why we're launching a new mandatory training program today." The doors opened, and a team of diversity consultants walked in, carrying tablets and training materials. They weren't just any consultants. They were experts who had worked with police departments and major corporations across the country. "Every single security officer, from part-time to chief, will go through this program," Mr. Johnson announced. "But it's not just about sitting through sessions. It's about real change." He gestured to Marcus, who joined them at the front of the room. Marcus, looking poised in a suit that matched his father's, addressed the room. "This program isn't about shame or blame," he said, speaking with a confidence that made Sullivan marvel at his maturity. "It's about understanding. It's about seeing people as people first, not as stereotypes or threats." Sullivan watched as the faces in the room transformed from defensive to interested. He saw Officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed the incident, nodding along. Even the most skeptical-looking supervisors were leaning forward in their seats. "I'll be leading some of these sessions myself," Sullivan announced, surprising many in the room. "Because there's power in admitting our mistakes and learning from them. What happened last week could have ended my career. Instead, it gave me a chance to help change our entire approach to security." The training program outline appeared on the screen. A comprehensive 6-week course that would combine classroom sessions with real-world scenarios. It wasn't just about racial bias. It covered all forms of prejudice and discrimination. "We're not just changing policies," Mr. Johnson concluded. "We're changing hearts and minds." Richardson Mills International Airport will become a model for other airports across the country. And it all started because one officer had the courage to admit he was wrong, and one young man had the wisdom to show forgiveness. As the meeting wrapped up, Sullivan watched as security officers approached Marcus and Mr. Johnson, some apologizing for times they might have shown similar biases, others asking how they could help with the program. The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the room with warm light that seemed to promise a brighter future. In that moment, Sullivan realized that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from punishment, but from people willing to learn, grow, and work together for something better. The incident that could have ended careers was instead launching a movement that would ripple through airports across the nation. 6 months later, Richardson Mills International Airport had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The same terminal where Marcus had once been humiliated now hosted a state-of-the-art training center, its walls adorned with photos of diverse airport staff and inspirational quotes about inclusion. On this particular morning, Marcus stood at a podium in the airport's main conference hall, addressing a group of 50 high school students from underserved communities. Behind him, a banner read, "Aviation Dreams. Your future takes flight." The program he'd helped create was already changing lives. 6 months ago, I was treated like a criminal in this very airport, Marcus said, his voice carrying confidence and purpose. Today, I'm helping other young people see that they belong here too. In the audience, Officer Sullivan sat quietly, now serving as one of the program's mentors. The students leaned forward, captivated by Marcus's story. Among them was a young girl named Sarah, whose eyes sparkled with determination. Just last week, she had received her first flying lesson through the program's scholarship initiative. "But this isn't just about airports," Marcus continued, gesturing to the room filled with aviation industry leaders from across the country. "It's about changing how we see each other everywhere." CNN and local news cameras rolled, capturing what had become a national story of transformation. At the back of the room, Mr. Johnson watched proudly as his son commanded the stage. The incident that could have been just another viral video of discrimination had instead sparked a movement. Other airports were now calling daily, asking to implement their training program. Officer Sullivan stepped up to join Marcus at the podium, their unlikely friendship now a powerful symbol of change. When Marcus and his father chose education over punishment, Sullivan shared, his voice thick with emotion. They taught me that real security isn't just about spotting threats. It's about building trust. The statistics displayed on the screen behind them told the story. Complaints about racial profiling at the airport had dropped by 90%. Employee satisfaction had soared. Richardson Mills had been named Most Inclusive Workplace by Aviation Weekly, and their security training program was becoming the industry standard. But the real magic was happening in the small moments, like yesterday when a Muslim family was anxiously approaching security, and Officer Rodriguez went out of his way to make their children laugh. Or last week, when an elderly Chinese couple lost their way, and 3 different security officers competed to help them, using translation apps on their phones. "Look around this room," Marcus said, gesturing to the diverse faces before him. Future pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers, and yes, security officers. This is what change looks like. The students beamed, many of them already wearing the Aviation Dreams program badges. Mr. Johnson finally joined his son at the podium, placing a hand on his shoulder. "6 months ago, my son taught us all about grace under pressure," he said. "Today, he's teaching us about leadership." The room erupted in applause as Marcus blushed, still humble despite his growing role as a youth leader. After the ceremony, Sullivan watched as Marcus chatted with the students, answering questions about internships and mentoring opportunities. The officer touched the new pin on his uniform, a small pair of golden wings with the words "Guardian of the Skies," part of the airport's reformed security approach. As the sun set through the terminal's massive windows, casting a warm glow across the gathered crowd, Marcus caught Sullivan's eye and smiled. They both knew that what had started as a moment of prejudice had blossomed into something extraordinary, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. The airport's loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing departures and arrivals, but now the voice was warmer, more welcoming. Outside, planes continued their eternal dance of takeoffs and landings, but inside, something more important was soaring. Hope for a future where everyone could truly feel at home in the skies above and the terminals below.